That's it for inheritance? My son complained, his voice echoing off the polished mahogany of the lawyer's desk. The sound, so full of disbelief and greed, was like a physical blow. $50,000? After everything Dad built? This is a joke. He threw the single sheet of paper down, its crispness a stark contrast to the limp disdain on his face. His handsome features, a cruel and perfect copy of his father's, twisted into a mask of pure indignation. I just sat there, my hands folded tightly over the worn leather of my purse, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Mr. Davis, our lawyer for 30 years and a man who had seen us through contracts, property closings, and now this, didn't even flinch. He simply adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, his gaze level and unnervingly calm. The $50,000, he said, his tone dangerously mild, a gentle wave preceding a tsunami, was a gift, Mark. And it was contingent upon a specific condition your father outlined in a private codicil. A condition which, I'm afraid, has been irrevocably broken. The air in the room, already stuffy with unspoken resentment, turned to solid ice. My son, Mark, stared at the lawyer, his jaw working silently, a muscle twitching in his cheek. His wife, Susan, who had been preening like a cat who'd cornered a canary, froze with her perfectly manicured hand halfway to her string of pearls. They thought this was the end of a long, dutiful wait, the glorious payday after years of tolerating an old man's decline. They had no idea it was the beginning of the end for the world they knew. They had no idea about the lifetime of secrets I held behind my quiet, grieving widow's facade. Let me know what city you're watching from and subscribe to the channel, because I promise you, this story is about to unravel a family's darkest secrets. One by one, Mark found his voice first, a sputtering, angry rush of words that tumbled over each other. A condition? What condition? What in God's name are you talking about? Dad would never put conditions on my inheritance. I was his only son. His legacy. Richard was a very meticulous man. As you well know, Mr. Davis said, his eyes flicking to me for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a look of pity, but of shared understanding. A silent acknowledgement of the storm we both knew was about to break over these two unsuspecting heads. He was very specific in his final wishes. The documentation regarding the condition and its violation is extensive. He paused, letting the weight of the word violation settle into the room. I need a moment to gather the relevant files from the vault. Perhaps it would be best if we reconvene tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp. It was a brilliant, cruel move, a delay, a 24-hour marination in their own anxiety. It sent Mark into a spiral of impotent fury. He wanted his answers, and more importantly, his money. Now, tomorrow? No. I want to know now. What did she do? He jutted his chin in my direction, his eyes narrowing with an accusation he'd been nursing for years. What have you been telling him, Mom? Whispering in his ear, poisoning his mind against me while he was sick and confused? I didn't answer. I could have. I could have reminded him that for the last 6 months of his father's life, the only whispers Richard heard were from the hospice nurses, because his own son couldn't be bothered to visit. Instead, I just met his gaze, my expression as placid as a frozen lake. Inside, a lifetime of swallowed words, of injustices large and small, churned like a tempest. Oh, if only he knew. If only he knew the real poison wasn't my words, but his own actions, distilled over 40 years into a venom that had finally, irrevocably broken his father's heart. Susan, ever the supportive wife when a fortune was on the line, placed a placating hand on his arm. Calm down, honey. It's just a misunderstanding. Your father adored you. We'll sort it all out tomorrow. Her eyes, however, shot daggers at me. They weren't the eyes of a daughter-in-law. They were the eyes of a rival, a competitor. She saw me not as a grieving mother, but as a dragon guarding a treasure she believed was rightfully, and now urgently, theirs. They stormed out of the office, their angry whispers about senility and undue influence trailing behind them like a foul odor. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me in a sudden, profound silence with Mr. Davis. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet room. Are you all right, Eleanor? He asked, his professional demeanor softening into the concerned expression of an old friend. I'm as all right as I can be, James, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Richard wanted it this way. He insisted. He did, the lawyer confirmed, already pulling a thick, worn ledger from the depths of his briefcase instead of going to any vault. The vault was a ruse. The evidence was already here. He said he spent 50 years building a kingdom for a prince who thought he was already a king. His last act on this earth was to make sure the true queen was finally given her crown. I went home to a house that felt cavernous without Richard in it. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a sharp, painful reminder of his absence. But tonight, it wasn't just his absence I felt. It was the looming, suffocating presence of the truth. Mark's angry words echoed in the stillness. "What did you do?" "What did I do?" I walked into the grand living room, my fingers trailing over the worn velvet of the armchair where Richard used to sit. The indentations still faintly visible. I had done what I always did. I had survived. I had endured. I had held this family, this life, this entire empire together with thread and glue while Richard built the gleaming facade. My mind drifted back, not to the recent, painful years of his illness, but further. Much further. To the very beginning. I remembered being 22 years old, standing in the blackened, still smoldering rubble of Richard's first business venture, a small hardware store that had been his entire world. "A fire," he'd said. "Faulty wiring. We lost everything." We were standing on the sidewalk, watching the last of the gray smoke curl into a grayer sky, and he was a completely broken man. The cocksure charmer I'd married was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger. "It's over, Ellie," he'd whispered, his face streaked with soot and tears. "Everything I worked for. My father was right about me. I'm a failure. We're ruined." I hadn't said a word. I just went to the bank the next day. My parents, simple, frugal people who had lived through the Depression, had left me a small inheritance. They'd warned me about Richard, about his grand ambitions and his cavalier attitude with money. "A man like that will build you a palace or a prison, Ellie, and sometimes you don't know which it is until the door locks behind you," my father had said. Their legacy wasn't a fortune, but it was everything to me, a sacred trust. $10,000, a sum that felt astronomical in 1972. I took every last cent, my hands shaking, and put it in Richard's hand that evening. "Start again. Richard," I told him, my voice firm. "This time, we do it together." He'd stared at the bundle of cash, then at me, his eyes wide with a humiliating mixture of shame and awe. "I'll pay you back, Ellie," he'd sworn, his voice cracking. "I'll pay you back tenfold. I swear it, no one will ever know. This will be our secret." And it was. It became the foundational secret upon which our entire life, our entire family was built. Mark never knew. He was born a year later, into a world where his father was already a local success story, a man who had, by his own dramatic telling, risen from the ashes by sheer force of will and business acumen. He never knew that the ashes had been cleared away by his mother's quiet, terrifying sacrifice. The phone rang, its shrill, demanding tone cutting through my reverie. I knew it was him before I even glanced at the caller ID. "Well?" Mark's voice barked. With no preamble. "No, hello, no, how are you? Are you going to tell me what this is about, or do I have to get my own lawyer?" "Susan is already looking up probate attorneys." "The lawyer said to meet tomorrow, Mark," I said calmly, refusing to be drawn into his whirlwind of rage. "I don't want to wait until tomorrow." "This is about the money, isn't it? You've got it all, don't you? You probably have it tucked away in some secret account. Dad was a millionaire. Everyone in town knew it. $50,000 doesn't even cover the property taxes on my house for the year." I could hear Susan in the background, her voice a poisonous, sibilant whisper. "Ask her about the jewelry, Mark. Ask her about the art collection. She's probably already had it appraised." "I have nothing to say to you tonight, Mark," I said, my voice low and final. "You will hear everything you need to hear tomorrow. At 10 in the lawyer's office." "You've always been like this," he shouted, his voice cracking with a petulant fury that belonged to a teenager, always so secretive, so controlling. "You were jealous of me and Dad, weren't you? You hated how close we were." The accusation, so old and tired, landed with a dull, familiar thud. "Jealous? Oh, my sweet, foolish boy, I wasn't jealous. I was terrified of the man his father was so carelessly turning him into, a man who measured love in dollars and respect in square footage." I remembered Mark's 16th birthday. He wanted a car, not just any car. A brand new, cherry red sports car that cost more than my father had earned in 5 years. I had argued against it, pleaded against it. He needs to learn the value of $1, Richard, I'd said one night. Our voices low in the kitchen. He needs to work for things, let him get a summer job. Save up, buy a used car, it will mean something to him. Richard had just waved a dismissive hand. A gesture I had come to loathe. He's my son. Eleanor, he's not going to be bagging groceries like some common laborer. He deserves the best. He bought the car, and when Mark, showing off for his friends, crashed it 6 months later, wrapping it around an old oak tree and walking away without a scratch, Richard bought him another one, a newer one, an even better one, each gift. Each easy dollar was another brick in the wall Richard was building between our son and reality. Richard called it love. I saw it for what it was. Guilt for the secret he carried. The secret that his entire success was built on my back. He wasn't giving gifts to his son. He was making offerings to his own conscience. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling not with fear, but with a cold, rising anger. I walked up the grand, sweeping staircase, the one Mark believed was a testament to his father's genius. And went to Richard's study. It was the one room I had avoided since he passed. It still smelled of him. Old books, leather, and the faint, sweet scent of the pipe tobacco he wasn't supposed to have, but that I pretended not to notice. I didn't turn on the main light. Just the small green banker's lamp on his massive desk. My eyes scanned the shelves, filled with leather-bound sets of classics he'd never read, but that looked impressive to visitors. I wasn't looking for them. My hand went to a row of leather-bound encyclopedias behind them. My fingers found the familiar cold metal of a small, locked box. I still had the key. I'd worn it on a thin, tarnished silver chain around my neck for 50 years, hidden beneath my blouse. It was the key to my past, and now to my future. With a click, the lock opened. Inside the box wasn't gold or jewels or stock certificates. It was something far more valuable. It was the truth. There were old, brittle documents, the original incorporation papers for Richard's Renovations, his second, wildly successful company. And stapled to them, another document, a private partnership agreement signed by him and by me, notarized 50 years ago by a justice of the peace in the next county over. It stated that I, Eleanor Vance, was a 60% silent partner in consideration for providing the initial and subsequent seed capital. And beneath that was something even more damning. My ledger, the one I had started all those years ago. In my own neat, looping script, I had tracked every dollar I had funneled from my own secret savings account into his business over the first 10 desperate years, money I earned from a small mail-order dress pattern business I ran from the kitchen table while Mark was a baby. It wasn't just the initial 10,000. It was hundreds here, 1,000 there, all the little infusions of cash that kept the business afloat when a contract fell through or a client paid late. All told, I had put in nearly $50,000 of my own money before the business was truly, safely stable. The very sum he had mockingly thrown back at the lawyer. The sum Richard had chosen for his final, cruel test. I closed the box, a grim, aching sense of satisfaction settling over me. Richard had kept his promise. He had never told our secret, but he had made damn sure the proof of it would not die with him. I slipped the ledger and the partnership agreement into my large purse. Tomorrow, Mark wanted answers. Tomorrow, he would get them. The next morning felt different. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt a flicker of something other than grief. It felt like resolve, like the calm before a necessary storm. I chose my outfit with deliberate care. A simple, impeccably tailored navy blue dress, my good pearls, and the sensible, low-heeled shoes that Mark always made fun of, calling them my old lady shoes. I was not dressing for a funeral. I was dressing for a reckoning. When I arrived at Mr. Davis's office, Mark and Susan were already there. They sat stiffly on the expensive leather sofa, a united front of simmering resentment. Mark looked as if he hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot and his expensive suit looked rumpled. He was tapping his foot, a frantic, impatient rhythm on the plush carpet. Susan gave me a look of pure loathing and then pointedly turned her head to whisper something in her husband's ear. They stopped abruptly when Mr. Davis entered the room, carrying a formidable-looking stack of files bound in red ribbon. "Good morning," he said, his voice the epitome of professional decorum. He sat behind his desk and arranged the files in a neat, ominous row. Mark, you had questions about the condition attached to your father's gift. Just get on with it, Davis, Mark snapped, his voice rough. Mr. Davis nodded. Very well. He opened the first, thickest file. Mark, before we discuss the condition, I think it's important to establish a baseline. What do you believe your father's net worth was at the time of his passing? Mark scoffed, a humorless, arrogant sound. I don't know, exactly. 10, 15 million? The business, the commercial properties, the stock portfolio. He was a giant in this city. He built an empire. He did, Mr. Davis agreed smoothly. An empire. But there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding about who actually owned that empire. You see, the entity you think of as your father's business was, in fact, a legal partnership. He slid a yellowed, fragile document across the vast expanse of the desk. It was the 50-year-old partnership agreement from the metal box. Mark picked it up, his brow furrowed in confusion. Susan leaned over his shoulder, her perfume cloying and sharp, to read it. What is this? Mark asked, his voice suddenly smaller, less certain. A partnership? With who? He never had a partner. With your mother, Mr. Davis said quietly, his words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was as if the air had been sucked from the room. Mark's eyes darted from the paper to my face and back again. He was searching for the punchline, the trick, the legal loophole. He found none. That's impossible, he stammered, shaking his head. Mom didn't have any money. Her parents were. They were nomadis. They lived in a tiny little house. Her parents were careful, I said, and my voice was clear and strong, a voice they had never heard from me before. And they left me what they had. It was the money I gave your father to start his second business after the first one burned to the ground. The business you've built your entire life and identity on. Susan let out a little gasp, a sound of theatrical disbelief. Richard told us he rebuilt from scratch. He said he pulled himself up by his bootstraps with nothing but grit. A comforting story, Mr. Davis interjected smoothly, taking control once more. And one your mother was gracious enough to allow him to tell for 50 years. But the facts and the legally binding documents tell a different story. Your mother, Eleanor, as a 60% founding partner, was and is the majority shareholder in the entire Vance enterprise. The homes, the stocks, the business itself. Legally, the vast majority of it has always been hers. What Richard left in his will was from his own, personal, 40% minority share. He was, in essence, a highly compensated employee of your mother's initial capital. I watched my son's face. It was a slow-motion collapse. The arrogance, the entitlement, the cocksure belief in his own inherited genius, it all just crumbled away like a building imploding, leaving behind a pale, slack-jawed shock. The world as he knew it, the very foundation of his identity, had just been turned upside down. The powerful father he worshipped was a myth of his own creation, enabled by my silence. The quiet, unassuming mother he'd always dismissed, the woman he saw as little more than a household manager, was the true source of the power and wealth he coveted. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in his adult life. He saw not just Mom, but the woman on the paper. The silent titan. The secret queen. So, everything? He whispered, his voice hoarse with dawning horror. The house? The company? The portfolio? It's all yours? Yes, Mark, I said softly. It is. But Mr. Davis wasn't finished. This was just the foundation. The financial humiliation was merely the prelude. The final act, the true reckoning, was yet to come. Subscribe now if you haven't already, because you will not believe the final, devastating condition his father left behind. This, however, Mr. Davis continued, picking up a second, much thinner file, brings us to the $50,000 gift from your father's personal share and the condition attached to it. Mark seemed to have shrunk into the plush leather of the chair. He was no longer the belligerent heir demanding his due. He was a confused little boy who had just learned the world wasn't flat and that he was standing on the wrong side of it. Mr. Davis opened the file. Inside was a single, heavy cream-colored envelope, sealed with a blob of dark blue wax bearing Richard's signet ring. Your father left a letter, to be opened only in the event that this meeting, in this specific manner, became necessary. He had hoped it wouldn't. He had hoped, in his final months, that you would prove him wrong. He broke the seal with a small, sharp tear that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He unfolded the letter, written in Richard's familiar, spidery, and near the end, shaky hand. He began to read. To my son, Mark, if you are hearing this letter, it means your greed has outweighed your love. It means that in my absence, you have seen your mother not as a grieving woman to be cared for, but as a vault to be emptied. I have made many mistakes as your father, and my greatest one was you, not the boy you were, but the man I allowed you to become. I taught you how to take, but never how to give. I gave you everything you wanted, but I failed to give you what you needed: a backbone, a conscience, a heart. My eyes welled with tears, blurring the sight of my son's stricken face. I could hear Richard's voice in those words, thick with a regret so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. A third ghost alongside the myths of the great man and the loving son. Mr. Davis continued, his voice a steady, inexorable drumbeat of truth. I leave you a gift of $50,000. It is not much, I know, especially when measured against the fortune you feel you are owed. But even this small gift comes with one final test. A test of your character, the one thing I could not buy for you. The condition is this: to receive this money, you must have, in the 6 months following my death, demonstrated genuine, unprompted, and selfless concern for your mother's well-being. A flicker of hope, of desperate, grasping hope, lit up in Mark's eyes. He sat up straighter. I did. I called her. I checked in. Mr. Davis held up a hand, a gesture of absolute authority, silencing him. He then pulled a second set of papers from the file. Your father, being a meticulous man to the end, defined the terms quite clearly. He hired a private service to log all communications to your mother's home and cell phone. He also took a sworn and notarized affidavit from her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Martha Gable. He laid the papers on the desk. They were logs, phone records, text messages, page after page of sterile, damning data. In the 182 days since your father's passing, Mr. Davis stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a simple recitation of facts, you, Mark, telephoned your mother's house a total of 7 times. The first call, the day after the funeral, lasted 32 seconds, in which you asked when the will would be read. The subsequent 6 calls all contain the same question, with increasing impatience. There is no record of you ever asking your mother how she was coping, if she needed groceries, if she was lonely. There is no record of you visiting her, not even once. He turned a page. There is, however, a record of your mother's neighbor, Martha Gable, driving your mother to 6 doctor's appointments for her arthritis. There is a record of Mrs. Gable bringing her meals 3 times a week for the first month. There is a record of Mrs. Gable's teenage son mowing your mother's lawn, free of charge, because he knew she couldn't manage the large yard herself. He looked up from the papers, his gaze pinning Mark to his chair. His eyes were like chips of granite. You did not ask about her health. You did not ask about her heart. You asked about your inheritance. You did not see a mother. You saw a bank account. Therefore, Mark, you have broken the condition. Irrevocably. My son's face was ashen, a sickly gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. It was Susan who spoke, her voice a shrill shriek of denial that shattered the funereal atmosphere. This is a trick. It's a setup. She set us up. She played the victim to get everything. She pointed a trembling, accusing finger at me. On the contrary, Mr. Davis said, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he read the final, brutal line of Richard's letter. In the event that my son fails this final, simple test of his humanity, the $50,000 is to be donated in its entirety to the St. Jude Hospice, in honor of the nurses who showed me more kindness and dignity in my final weeks than my own son showed me in a year. May God have mercy on your soul, Mark. You will need it. Signed, your father, Richard Vance. Silence. It was the most complete, most profound silence I have ever experienced. It was the sound of a life's worth of lies crashing down. It was the sound of a man's soul being weighed on the scales of his father's disappointment and being found wanting. And in that silence, something inside me finally, beautifully, broke free. It wasn't a collapse of grief, but a shattering of burden. The weight I had carried for 50 years, the weight of the secret, the guilt over my son's character, the lonely duty to uphold Richard's myth, it all just evaporated. I looked at Mark, this 45-year-old man who looked like a lost, punished child, his face a canvas of shock and dawning horror. And for the first time, I felt nothing. Not anger. Not hatred. Not even the bitter satisfaction of victory. Just a vast, empty, and liberating pity. He was a stranger to me, a ghost created by his father's guilt and his own unquenchable greed. The son I loved, the little boy who used to bring me fistfuls of dandelions from the yard, had died a long, long time ago. I was finally, utterly free to mourn him. Mark finally found his voice, a choked, desperate rasp. Mom? He was looking for an ally. For a denial. For me to say it wasn't true, that the lawyer was mistaken, that his father couldn't have meant it, that it was all a terrible mistake. I met his desperate gaze and gave him the only thing I had left to give. The cold, unvarnished truth. Your father saw everything, Mark, I said, and my voice didn't shake. Especially at the end. When there was nothing left to look at but the truth. He saw it all. He and Susan left without another word. There was nothing left to say. The door clicked shut behind them, and this time the silence was peaceful. It was clean. Mr. Davis began quietly packing the files away. Richard loved you very much. Eleanor, he said softly, not looking at me. He told me that his biggest regret was that in trying to give you a palace, he had built you a beautiful cage. He said this was his way of finally giving you the keys. I nodded, a single tear tracing a slow, warm path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release. I drove home. And as I pulled into the driveway, I looked at the big, stately house that had always felt more like Richard's monument than my home. But today, it looked different. It wasn't looming or oppressive. It looked smaller. It looked manageable. It looked like mine. For the next few weeks, I moved through the house with a new sense of purpose. I wasn't just an occupant anymore. I was the owner in spirit as well as in fact. I packed up Richard's study, donating the unread leather-bound books to the local library. I took down the ostentatious oil paintings he had bought at auction, and, from the attic, I brought down the simple, lovely watercolors my own mother had painted, their faded colors bringing more light to the walls than the dark oils ever had. One sunny afternoon, I was in my garden, my true sanctuary, the one place that had always been wholly and completely mine, weeding the rose bushes. My hands were covered in rich, dark earth, the sun was warm on my back, and I felt a sense of profound peace that had eluded me for most of my adult life. My phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I answered it anyway, unafraid. Hello? A hesitant voice, one I barely recognized, answered. Mom? It was Mark. I got a letter from the St. Jude Hospice, he said, his voice flat and lifeless. They sent a thank you card. To the family. For the donation. For Dad's generosity. I waited, saying nothing, pulling a stubborn thistle from the soil around a Queen Elizabeth rose. I'm sorry, he whispered, and the words sounded rusty, unused, like they'd been dragged up from a deep, dry well. For everything. Was he sorry for his greed? For his neglect? Or was he just sorry he'd been caught and disinherited in the most humiliating way possible? I didn't know. And I realized with a startling, liberating clarity that it didn't matter. His apology was for him, not for me. My healing, my future, that was my own business now. Goodbye, Mark, I said, my voice gentle but firm, and I ended the call. I put the phone down on the small garden bench and looked around at my roses, their buds tight and promising a riot of color. The world was quiet. The future was a blank page. I could sell this big, empty house and buy a small cottage by the sea. I could travel to Italy, something I'd always dreamed of doing. I could use the fortune I had quietly built to set up a foundation in my own name, a foundation to help young women start their own businesses, to give them the kind of support I never had. The possibilities were endless. They were all mine. Richard's inheritance for me wasn't the house or the money or the stocks. His final gift, the one that truly mattered, was my own life. After 50 years in a gilded cage, he had finally, blessedly, given me back to myself. And that was a treasure beyond any price. Comment below and tell me which part of this story left you completely speechless, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that uncover the truth that always, eventually, comes to light.